For decades, India has hosted China's biggest spiritual nemesis, the Dalai Lama. A living embodiment of Tibetan resistance sits on Indian soil. While Indian soldiers face off against Chinese troops in Ladakh and diplomats spar over maps, one wonders, has New Delhi truly used its most potent psychological leverage against China? Or has India allowed its greatest moral advantage to gather dust? That is the question we answer today when we also ask whether if the next Dalai Lama would be born in India or maybe even outside of India, could India lose its big leverage against China? Hello and welcome. You're watching Statecraft with me, Geeta Mohan. India's Tibet movement began in 1959 when it granted asylum to the exiled Tibetan spiritual leader, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, after China crushed the Lhasa uprising. Since then, the Dalai Lama and thousands of Tibetan exiles have lived in India, forming a unique pressure point against Beijing. Yet, India has rarely leaned into it with force. Why has New Delhi maintained such caution over a figure Beijing considers its ultimate red line? When Jawaharlal Nehru granted asylum to the Dalai Lama in 1959, it wasn't just humanitarian instinct, it was a geopolitical gamble as well. China's invasion of Tibet had swallowed a strategic buffer state. By protecting the Tibetan leader, India gave refuge not only to a person, but to a cause. Tibet's theocratic government was shattered, but its moral nucleus, its Dalai Lama, survived in India. From that moment, China saw India not just as a neighbor, but as a threat. Despite the opportunity, Nehru never swung the Dalai Lama as a political weapon. Instead, he maintained a rigid distinction. India would host the Dalai Lama, but not his politics. Chinese aggression, especially in 1962, didn't change that equation. Nehru viewed Tibet through the lens of idealism and non-alignment, not realpolitik. India's policy: house the monk but mute the movement. China, meanwhile, was not fooled. It fumed, threatened, and considered the Dalai Lama a splittist, making a clear distinction that he's not just a separatist. In the year 2003, under the then Prime Minister, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, India formally recognized Tibet as part of China in a joint declaration saying that it is an autonomous region of China. It was supposed to open doors, get China to recognize Sikkim as part of India, maybe soften the border dispute. While this tactic worked a little, China never lets things go easily, and in order to retaliate, it doubled down on support for Pakistan, blocked India's entry into the nuclear suppliers group, and continued to claim Arunachal Pradesh.
Look, I would refrain from using big words like masterstrokes and so on. I think foreign policy is constantly evolving. It has to respond to conditions, the situation at any given point in time, which of course does not mean, as we just discussed, that there shouldn't be a position. I mean, there has to be clarity. I think there's a certain lack of clarity there. In terms of the 2003 agreement to recognize, what the Indian government did was recognize the Tibet Autonomous Region as part of China. It doesn't make a statement on, the history of Tibet. It does not in any way say that India recognizes Tibet as historically being part of China, which is the sort of the acknowledgement that the Chinese want from India. And that can never happen because that is not true. So I think in terms of a quid pro quo, we got Sikkim recognized as part of Indian territory. The Chinese were refusing to acknowledge Sikkim as part of Indian territory for the longest time until 2003. So I think we got that done. Now, in terms of, why didn't we bring Kashmir on board? Look, it's a balance of what we have to bargain with or what do we have to negotiate with. And at that point in time, if you look at the 1963 agreement between between China and Pakistan, by which China took over this portion of J&K under Pakistani occupation, the Chinese themselves say that they will, revisit this agreement with the Pakistanis based on how the Kashmir dispute would eventually be settled. So I think in that sense, we can hold the Chinese to that. The Chinese are not saying that they are siding with the Pakistanis at least on paper. In practical terms, of course, that is what has happened. The Chinese do support the Pakistani position on Kashmir. But, if you were to use legalese, international agreements and so on, the Chinese are being neutral on Kashmir. And that, I think, is part of the same system other countries follow.
While India affirmed Tibet's status, China refuses to recognize India's sovereignty over Jammu and Kashmir. Worse, it backs Pakistan's claims, builds roads through Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, and objects to Indian maps. It's a one-sided deal. India has occasionally used the Dalai Lama card like a matchstick. Brief flare-ups during times of diplomatic frost, but it has avoided making Tibet a sustained part of its strategic doctrine. The result? Tactical gains, but strategic stagnation. China sees the Dalai Lama issue as existential. India treats it as a side note. That's the asymmetry. Beijing overreacts to every Tibetan mention. In fact, it has gone a step further and says that Tibet is an integral part of China. It fears that even symbolic recognition of Tibet autonomy could ripple across Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, and Hong Kong. That fear is India's leverage, but India has rarely pushed. Instead of building an international coalition around Tibetan rights, India has mostly gone it alone, quiet, cautious, and cornered. India doesn't have to recognize Tibetan independence to play its card better. It could increase high-profile diplomatic engagements with the Dalai Lama, host global Tibet conferences, internationalize the succession debate itself, push for Tibetan human rights at the UN, support Tibetan language and culture through soft power. These aren't acts of war, they're acts of will. Other democracies, from the US to Japan to Europe, would likely back India in elevating the Tibetan issue. The Dalai Lama is respected worldwide. India, as his host and spiritual sanctuary, has moral capital. It just needs the courage to spend it. Fast forward to Narendra Modi's India. In 2014, the presence of the Tibetan Sikyong at Modi's swearing-in ceremony raised eyebrows in Beijing. Then came a wave of calibrated defiance. The Dalai Lama's 2016 Rashtrapati Bhavan invitation and his 2017 trip to Tawang, Arunachal Pradesh, territory China calls South Tibet. This wasn't subtle, it was symbolic, and it rattled Beijing's cages. But was it enough? Just when it seemed India might embrace Tibet as leverage, came a sharp pivot. Following the 2017 Doklam standoff, New Delhi moved swiftly into damage control mode. In early 2018, then Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale sent a confidential note to Cabinet Secretary P.K. Sinha with a clear instruction: avoid all events marking the 60th anniversary of the Dalai Lama's exile. The note warned, and I quote, "The proposed period will be a very sensitive time in the context of India's relations with China. Participation by senior leaders or government functionaries, either from the central government or state governments, is not desirable and should be discouraged." After Chinese troops killed 20 Indian soldiers in the Galwan Valley, India hardened its posture. Military buildup in Ladakh intensified. The Quad was revived, and in July 2021, Prime Minister Modi made a quiet but thunderous call: the first public birthday greeting to the Dalai Lama in years. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. A diplomatic nudge, not a punch, but still a departure from silence. The world also got a glimpse of another Tibet card, the Special Frontier Force, an elite Indian unit comprised mostly of Tibetan refugees. When one of their soldiers, Nyima Tenzin, died during a 2020 mission near Pangong Tso, his funeral, draped in Tibetan and Indian flags, was a message to Beijing. Tibetans are not just spiritual exiles, they're battle-ready patriots. India's hesitation isn't born out of timidity, it's strategic calculus. Openly weaponizing the Dalai Lama risks destabilizing an already fragile Himalayan frontier. China could retaliate militarily, economically, or by stepping up support for Pakistan. And any perceived manipulation of the Dalai Lama could jeopardize the safety and legitimacy of the Tibetan exile community in India. Complicating matters further is the Dalai Lama himself. He has repeatedly emphasized his mission as spiritual, not political. He opposes violence, advocates dialogue, and insists that India has never used him against China. He is India's card, yes, but not one that wants to be played in anger or revenge. As he turns 90 on July 6, 2025, the Dalai Lama's time is finite. His reincarnation will spark a geopolitical crisis. China insists it will appoint the next Dalai Lama through its puppet institutions in Tibet. India, where the Tibetan government in exile resides, where the Dalai Lama resides, could reject this entirely and support an alternative. The stage is set for an ideological and diplomatic explosion. This is India's real Tibet card, not the man, but what comes after him. As the Dalai Lama turns 90, the battle over his spiritual legacy has erupted into a full-blown geopolitical dispute. The Tibetan leader has firmly declared that his reincarnation will occur outside Chinese-controlled territory and that only the Garden Phodrang Trust, his own institution, holds the authority to recognize the next Dalai Lama.
경호군이 너림 문신 제조 대 자동 외면 낭세신 영시 문신기 제거 경구소 달라라메 라장 간대포장 이지계획 이지계제 왕대 gen진 남의 여보다 공주 별규 낭전 추규하게 우주 라전 남보당 경호군이 나름 당 리더 지신 로베 담된 추송 칼라 그때 람드 시디 영주 타스 문신 문수시 용유래 셰수자 티슈 미소베 네올은 교가야 매버체지 꾸기 고메버 가조레 교가야 매버체 꾸기 이자지 라마 다람살라 다람살네 샤제게노 체모 다랄라마 덴지자스 퍼게로 니동자다 나중에 저주 수준배 신주 노스베세 니주 치르 니동주미 니사와 나가베세 니지 라 기버 개월 규지스.
This stance directly challenges Beijing's long-standing claim to control all major Tibetan Buddhist appointments. In reaffirming the continuation of the centuries-old lineage, the Dalai Lama has not only rejected Chinese interference but also reignited the global fight for Tibetan spiritual sovereignty. Beijing, clinging to its golden urn ritual and Communist Party laws, insists that the next Dalai Lama must be born and approved within China.
活佛转世是藏传佛教特有的传承方式，已经延续了700多年，形成了严密的宗教仪轨和历史定制。达赖、班禅等大活佛转世灵童需经凭撤签认定，中央政府批准。14世达赖本人就是在13世达赖喇嘛圆寂之后，严格按照宗教仪轨和历史定制寻访，由当时的国民政府颁令特准免于经凭撤签继任的。中国政府实行宗教信仰自由政策，颁有宗教事务条例和藏传佛教活佛转世管理办法，依法保护活佛转世这一传承方式。达赖喇嘛的转世必须坚持国内寻访、经凭撤签、中央政府批准的原则，遵循宗教仪轨和历史定制，按照国家的法律法规办理。 你提到宗教中国化，我想宗教中国化不是对宗教的限制，任何宗教的生存和发展都需要和国家的社会环境和文化传统相适应。藏传佛教诞生于中国，是有中国特点的宗教，本身就是中国化的典范。
This sets the stage for a potentially explosive scenario. Two rival Dalai Lamas, one backed by the Tibetan exile community and another endorsed by the Chinese state. It has happened before with the Pancham Lama. But such a division would not only fracture Tibetan Buddhism, but also provoke fierce diplomatic backlash, especially from India and Western democracies that support Tibetan autonomy. In essence, the spiritual succession has become a high-stakes test of religious freedom versus authoritarian control. If India recognizes a successor chosen by the Tibetan exile community, it directly challenges Beijing's legitimacy in Tibet. If India remains silent, it abandons Tibetans to Chinese control. This is where the Dalai Lama card turns nuclear, not in words or visits, but in succession. China is already preparing militarizing monasteries and grooming boy monks. Is India? Also, the larger question, if the trust chooses a Dalai Lama or a successor, a reincarnate outside of India, outside of China, it could be any country and India could lose leverage. Or could it be relief for India?
It is for His Holiness Dalai Lama to decide where and when to be reborn, right? So he will make the decision accordingly. We'll find the next Dalai Lama. So the fourth Dalai Lama was born in Mongolia. Sixth Dalai Lama was born in India, in Tawang, right? So technically, Dalai Lama could be born anywhere, for sure. Having said that, His Holiness Dalai Lama always says, I am a son of India because with the dal and the roti that I had of India helped with my body, and the Nalanda, the tradition taught me this wisdom. So my brain and body are both majorly influenced by India. So he does say proudly that I am a proud son of India. And, so obviously, he has been in India all his life. So there is a high likelihood that he will be born in India. But having said that, you cannot rule out where, His Holiness next Dalai Lama will be reborn. You can never say, because it is for His Holiness Dalai Lama to decide where to be reborn, Having said that, I'm writing a book on democracy and exile. So whenever you establish government exile, host country is very important. Host country can derail you or help you succeed in your mission. So having said that, India has been the biggest supporter of Tibet and Tibetans, for sure, right? By far. Politically and, overtly, America has issued many statements and supported also, but practically speaking, when we had nobody, India gave us our homeland where the Tibetan government exile is, and where the resident of His Holiness Dalai Lama is. So definitely India has been the biggest supporter. In that context, if you have to choose a safe country, I think India will be in the top category.
It's been 66 years since the Dalai Lama crossed into India. In that time, China has risen, bullied and bled India at the border. And yet, India has never made Tibet a frontline issue. That restraint has kept the peace, but it has also left power untapped. With the clock ticking on the Dalai Lama's life, the next move matters more than ever. Succession will be a test not just of Tibetan resilience, but Indian resolve. Will India continue to fold or finally play its hand? India has dealt with the Dalai Lama issue not very poorly, but wisely and maturely, but also very carefully. Diplomacy demands restraint, but strategy demands clarity. As the world's largest democracy hosts the world's most famous exile, the question remains, is India the guardian of Tibet's future or just a polite innkeeper of its past? Thank you for watching Statecraft.